Do you like a good mystery? You mystery readers? A good whodunit? While we were taking a drive on the way to and from vacation, Christine had bought a book on tape, which is not something that I'm used to doing, and not really big on audiobooks myself, being sort of a page and letter kind of guy. And I'm really not that into nonfiction, but this book, called The Forgotten Room, had a really great way to pique your interest, to kind of keep you engaged in the story. It was a mystery about a forgotten room. I'll let you kind of figure it out for yourself if you can. And just when you thought you had sort of the mystery solved, just as you thought you were getting ahead of the story, just as the storyline seemed to be falling into place, the author would take it in a new direction. There'd be a new twist, and so you kept wanting to come back and just keep listening. And unfortunately, it was a long book, and so our drive was over before the book was. So what are you supposed to do? Not one to be able to let things go very easily. Last week, after I had my message finished and was prepared for Sunday morning, late on Saturday night, I sat in the driveway, because my wife's a go-to-bed-early kind of person, and listened to the rest of the audiobook. So if you notice I was a little tired last week, the secret's out. That's really why it was, because I had stayed up late listening to the end of The Forgotten Room, and man, it was worth it. If you've ever been engaged in a good story like that, and I hope you have because it is great fun, you should know that that's a part of what the Gospels are meant to be. They're supposed to be intriguing stories, a great page-turner too. I know you've grown so accustomed to all the stories, you've heard these stories time and time again, that they seem rather dull and boring. You sort of gloss over as you're invited to read your book, your Bible on a daily basis, and sort of gloss over the story, but they are anything but dull and boring. They are really words of life. They are intriguing words of life that lead us deeper. You should treat them as a mystery. More often than not, people will say to me, well, I just don't understand what it says anyway. Well, if I would have gotten in the middle of The Forgotten Room and come to the conclusion, which I did, I don't understand where this story is going, and stopped, I would have never had the joy of making my way through this very twisty, turny, whodunit mystery story. So the story today is the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water, but I'm going to focus more on the introductory story that's going to kick off a series of 5 weeks on Jesus as the bread of life. In John's Gospel, there are a number of miracle stories, not many, actually, only 7, and in those stories, Jesus follows up with a discourse trying to explain what he means by the action. So today we have the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Next week we're going to have Jesus unpack that by saying that he is the bread of life. Even though our theme today is Jesus the bread of life, he doesn't say that in the story today. It's going to be conclusion of the sign, the miracle that he had done. So today we hear this introductory story. We actually get the primary story that is undergirding all of what we're going to talk about over the next 5 weeks. It's a familiar miracle story, isn't it? Every one of the Gospels has a miraculous feeding. It's the only miracle that all 4 Gospels include, if you don't count like the resurrection and things like that, but the things that Jesus did for other folks. In fact, in this story, we hear how Jesus feeds 5,000 people with barley loaves, and the details are what's important in John's Gospel. There's some really interesting details. Barley loaves were poor man's bread, and 2 fish. With next to nothing to provide for 5,000 people, Jesus makes a feast with 12 baskets of abundant leftovers. We're supposed to hear remnants of that first reading that David gave us. Nice job with Baal Shalisha, by the way. Hard reading. But we're supposed to see this idea that in God there is abundance. That as the bread of life, he provides abundantly for us. It's what the gospel told us about Jesus all along. In John chapter 1, verse 6, we read of Jesus, from his fullness of his grace, we've all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. So the story is beginning to tell itself from the very beginning, and John's gospel seems to be saying over and over to us, as it unravels its mystery, holy smokes, God is here. Tom Bandy, who's a church consultant, wrote in one of his books about a retreat that was attended by his wife, who's also a pastor. They asked a question during that retreat, throughout the retreat, kind of like the question that we ask our kids when we go on mission trips or week of service, which is, where did you see Jesus today, or where did you see God today? In this case, the question was, where have you seen God this summer? And of course, if I asked you that question, you'd all give me the look you're giving me right now. And there'd be a moment of silence until somebody would break that silence with what they thought was the answer. And more often than not, the people in the group began to answer. So I saw God in a beautiful sunset this summer. Another added that God was witnessed in a particularly moving piece of music. One after the other, people witnessed how they saw God in the natural world, whether man-made or God-made. And Bandy said that there was a woman in the group. She was about 35 years old, a professional woman, had 2 small children that was there for the weekend, and she was clearly uncomfortable. You could tell that she wasn't sure she should share. She was the last in the group. Finally, hesitantly, she said, "One morning this summer, I was awakened with an incredible compulsion to go see my ex-husband." Now, normally, I'm not a spontaneous person, she said. In fact, I really don't like my ex-husband. We haven't spoken in over a year. But I was filled with such a compulsion to see him that I literally couldn't resist it. She said, I gathered up my children, dressed hurriedly, and we drove over to his house. We found him collapsed on the floor, having experienced a massive heart attack. We called 911, and we saved his life. Another stunned silence, but instead of, it was. They stirred uncomfortably in their chairs, not sure what to make of the story. This was unexpected. Finally, someone whispered tensely, "Holy smokes." Now, this experience is a little different experience than seeing God in a sunset or an innocent child or a particularly profound piece of music. That experience that she shared reeked of a direct divine revelation. A woman feels the compulsion to see her ex-husband, which is in its own right sort of miraculous, but it's a compulsion too strong for her to push down and ignore, and she and her children go to the home and find him in the midst of a heart attack and save his life. How else do you explain it? Holy smokes, God was there. When people experience something direct from God, like a miraculous feeding, they can't help but exclaim, "Holy smokes, God is here." And that's indeed what happens in our gospel reading. In fact, they misread the cues, this miraculous agricultural sign, and instead of following it toward the one who provided the sign, they followed it to their own politic. Let's make him king. We don't have to have a social security system. If Jesus can always provide us with enough food, he would be that stopgap. This story is an important story, and there's some things to see in it about John's gospel that are unique in its telling of the miracle story. Again, there are 6 mass feeding stories, and John has a particular set of unique ways that it talks about it to help us better understand where the sign is pointing. First of all, John's gospel does not have any miracles. At least they're not called miracles. They're called signs. Now, there are only 7 of them in the entire gospel of John, versus Mark, which was one of the series we've been reading, where Jesus can't seem to get up and have breakfast without spontaneously creating some kind of miracle. John only has 7 of them, and they are specifically chosen to reveal something. And he doesn't call them miracles. He calls them signs. Like any sign, they are to direct us to another location. So, like if you were going to enter the highway here, the freeway, you would see a sign that would say, Los Angeles, Attaway, right? When you see the sign, are you at Los Angeles? No. You see the sign that points you towards something else, towards a desired destination, if you will. And that's what these signs in John's gospel will do for Jesus too. They're not an end in themselves, and that's what Jesus critiques about the people. We'll hear more about that next week, is that they were in love with the sign instead of the sign giver. He said there's a greater truth in this. So being king is not what Jesus is interested in doing. It's supposed to point us toward him as the Son of God. Now, secondly, notice in the passage that it spent a moment to say, this was near the Passover. That's kind of an important sign as well, remembering that the Passover is a meal associated with the Exodus and with Moses and with law-giving and Moses liberating God's people from enslavement in Egypt, the wandering in the wilderness and God providing the Ten Commandments, and also manna from heaven. Bread comes down from heaven. Remember the story as they're wandering out in the wilderness? The original hearers of the story would have made the connection because they were prepping for Passover and the manna in the wilderness. And here, outside of Capernaum on a hillside where there are no Denny's restaurants or McDonald's drive-thrus, that God again, with very little, provides them with abundance. 3, notice that Jesus doesn't need the disciples to help with this sign. Unlike the story we read last week, which was, we had skipped over it, so I retold the story of Mark's gospel, where Jesus actually has to have the disciples organize the whole thing. John doesn't need that. The Jesus in John's gospel does everything himself. Jesus takes the loaves and the fish, he distributes them to the people. Jesus takes the meager bread and the barley and makes of it a feast. One of the messages that John wants us to see is that Jesus can take the nothing that we are, the nothing sometimes that we feel we bring to life, the nothing left that we feel like sometimes we are, and can bring forth abundance. Now, he's going to say of himself, we miss it in this story the way it's rendered here, but in the Greek, when Jesus comes walking on the sea, he doesn't say, it is I. The Greek words are ego eimi, meaning I am. Anybody remember what that means? When Moses asks God in the wilderness, in the burning bush, who should he say the God is that sends him back to Pharaoh to liberate God's people, God from the burning bush says, I am. Jesus is making a claim. Just like as in creation, God created out of nothing, Jesus can take the nothing or the little and the meager and to make abundance out of it. Even when we're good as goners, God can provide. 4th, notice the detail that John gives us, that there's a lot of grass in this location. Why would a gospel writer take note that there's grass? Why would he do that? Why would he spend a little bit of time saying, there's plenty of grass on this hillside? Is he just trying to say, well, it's springtime? Because like here, Israel is similar in that they would only have grass on the hillsides in the springtime before it was burnt off in the heat. Is it just that? That little detail just supposed to tell it, oh, it's in the springtime? Because he's already told us that by saying it was the Passover. Passover always happens in the spring. Or is it to comfort people's minds in the knowledge that they won't have to sit on the cold, crusty, dirty, dusty dirt of the ground? Is it just that? It was a comfort thing. Like I said earlier, in the medieval cathedrals, there were no pews. Aren't you lucky to have a chair? Was it to point out comfort? I don't think so. I think John is foreboding something, leaning something forward into one of the other I am statements that Jesus is going to make. Today, or next week, we're going to hear him say, I am the bread of life. That's what this story of the feeding of the 5,000 is about. But there's another one. When Jesus said that he is the good shepherd, it says that he will lead his flocks into good pastures. Reminiscent of Psalm 23, of course. Good pastures aren't dry pastures. Good pastures are filled with grass. So even here, he's pointing to another sort of metaphor of how provision will come to God's people, not just in bread, but in the provision of good pastures. All of this is meant for us to say, holy smokes, God is here. In fact, it's the whole point of the gospel. At the end of the Gospel of John, we should say, holy smokes, God is here. John 21, we will hear John say about why he chose to write what he did. He says this, "Not everything Jesus did or said is written in this book." There's only 7 miracle stories, signs. "But these are written," he said, "so that you may come to believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing, you too might have life in his name." So we could say, holy smokes, God is here. We come into a sanctuary on any given Sunday. We come into our lives on any given day with some pretty basic needs, don't we? I mean, we like to think that we're pretty complicated, that we maybe the nice new Beamer, but when you get really down to what you need, it's pretty simple stuff. Love and relationship and connection with community. You don't need Paul Martins. You just need a little bread and some vegetables, and maybe from time to time some protein. It really comes down to some pretty basic sorts of stuff is what we're looking for. But sometimes those things are the things that get challenged most. Even in the midst of Paul Martins and Beamers, sometimes we find that the most important things are missing. Jesus knows that sometimes you don't have any resources left. God knows that human beings can be pushed to the limits on all sorts of things. He won't be a political leader to solve our political problems, our military problems, but he does want to be the Lord of our lives. He does want us to turn to him as a Savior. And in him, he says, in this particular sign, in this particular "I am the bread of life" statement, in him is abundant life, for he is the bread of life. So today, we've read the start of the story. Now, try to remember that this story is the base of the next 4 weeks of readings, even though we won't hear again about the feeding of the 5,000. Over the next 4 Sundays, Jesus will interpret for us what it means that he fed 5,000 people. What it means for him to be a source for us. Jesus is the bread of life, not to be understood as a metaphor, but as a literal revelation of who Jesus is and the abundant life and what the abundant life that he brings entails. Just as John's gospel claimed that Jesus was the Word made flesh in John 1, so also he is the bread of life. And in receiving him, you too can say, holy smokes, God is here. Amen.